I'm Jennifer Matos with the Noah Webster House and West Hartford Historical Society. I'm bringing you the 40th episode of our Armchair Tour of West Hartford history, and I have a special guest with me here today. This is Earl Exum, who is the president of the West Hartford African American Social and Cultural Organization, and we're standing out here in West Hartford Center in front of First Church because we're going to be talking about someone who is associated with the church in general. He is Reverend Lemuel Haynes, who is the first black man in the United States to be ordained as a minister at a major Protestant church. And I'm going to start off by having Earl tell us a little bit about how he became interested in Reverend Haynes.
Okay, thank you, Jen. So, one of the books that created an awakening for me about black history is a book called Before the Mayflower. And I later learned that Lemuel Haynes is referenced in that book about 10 times. So I was shocked to learn when I came to West Hartford and learned about Lemuel Haynes that very few people knew in West Hartford that he was actually born here in West Hartford. So when my children went to school and they had to represent a famous person from Connecticut, I discovered that there were no people of African descent for them to choose from that was offered in the curriculum. So later on I learned of many people and thought Lemuel Haynes would be a perfect person to potentially add to that curriculum.
Great. Thank you, Earl. So let me tell you a little bit about the Reverend Lemuel Haynes, so you too can understand his importance both in our town and really in the entire country. So Lemuel Haynes was a native of West Hartford. He was born here July 18th, 1753, and at the time this of course was called the West Division of Hartford. What's very interesting about Lemuel Haynes is he was born the son of an African man and a white woman. The identity of his parents have been debated by historians and theologians. No one knows for sure who Lemuel Haynes' father was, although he's described as being of an unmingled African extraction. And it's believed that his mother was of Scottish descent, a servant in the household of a man named John Haynes, and her name was Alice Fitch. And so she worked in this household of John Haynes, who was in the West Division. It's believed that John Haynes was a descendant of the original John Haynes to the colonies. He was the first governor of the Connecticut colony and was instrumental in writing the Fundamental Orders. Now, according to our town historian, Dr. Tracy Wilson, she thinks that Haynes might have took the name of his mother's master rather than that of his father, and that would imply that his father was enslaved. So what happened with Lemuel Haynes is he actually only lived here in West Hartford for about 5 months. So when he was 5 months old, he was given over to indentured servitude to a man named Deacon David Rose. He was a farmer in Granville, Massachusetts, and his wife, Elizabeth Fowler Rose, helped raise Lemuel Haynes. Part of the indenture required Rose to educate Haynes, and so as a young boy, he was exposed to the Calvinistic religious doctrine, and he was a regular churchgoer. According to his own recollections, Elizabeth Rose was really dedicated to his upbringing to the point where she considered him to be her own son, and he really laments her death when she passes away in 1775. Now, in 1774, when he's 21 years old, Lemuel Haynes, his indenture expires, and at that point we have the American Revolution brewing. So he actually joins his local militia in Granville, Massachusetts. They go over to Roxbury, Massachusetts after the battles of Lexington and Concord, and then in 1776 he travels with his militia to New York to protect Fort Ticonderoga. He remains on garrison duty, and there he contracts typhus, which requires him to head back home to Massachusetts. After his militia service, he really begins to study theology. So he studies with members of the clergy in both Connecticut and Massachusetts. And during this time, Haynes really begins to write down his thoughts about the slave trade and slavery, sermons, family prayers, and other theological works. And his writing was very much influenced by the scripture, abolitionism, and republicanism. So in 1776, he actually publishes a pamphlet called Liberty Further Extended. in which he says that an African has an undeniable right to his liberty. He was one of the earliest people probably to point out the irony of slave owners fighting for their own liberty while denying the right to those of African descent. And he wrote, "Liberty is equally as precious to a black man as it is to a white one, and bondage as equally as intolerable to the one as it is to the other." And I mentioned earlier, Haynes was a Calvinist, which was a sect of Protestantism rooted in the theology of John Calvin. And they believed in the absolute sovereignty of God and that human virtue was a reflection of God's love. Haynes received his license to preach in 1780, so he started preaching in his home congregation of Middle Granville, Massachusetts. And while living there, in the early 1780s, he met a young white school teacher named Elizabeth Babbitt. And they got married in 1783, and together they would go on to have 10 children between 1785 and 1803. Lemuel Haynes became an ordained minister in 1785. As we said, he was the first African-American man to be ordained as a minister at a major Protestant church in the United States. He preached in Torrington, Connecticut for 3 years. And then in 1788, he became the minister of West Parish Church of Rutland, Vermont. And today that's known as West Rutland's United Church of Christ. And there he led a mainly white congregation for 30 years. During this time, Middlebury College in Vermont granted Haynes an honorary Master's of Arts degrees, and this is the first honorary degree ever bestowed upon an African American. We mentioned earlier that Lemuel Haynes was very outspoken against slavery. And as he continued to argue against the slave trade, he also was against something called the colonization movement. So this was a movement of people who believed that slavery was wrong, but proposed that the only way to fix the problem was to send enslaved people back to Africa. And so there was something called the American Colonization Society, and it had a very large presence in Vermont. Haynes argued that people of African descent living in the United States should be entitled to the same rights as other citizens, and that having them resettle in Africa would not be beneficial. And as a Calvinist, he believed that God's providential plan would defeat slavery and lead to a harmonious integration of the races as equals. So he served in West Rutland, Vermont for over 30 years, but at the end of it, there were tensions between him and his congregation. Might have been a difference in politics and style, but it also might have been related to race. He left the church in 1818 and eventually ends his career in South Granville Congregational Church in New York State. So he actually died there in 1833 and is buried at the Lee Oatman Cemetery. He actually had a book written about him. So Reverend Timothy Mather Cooley, the pastor of First Church in Granville, Massachusetts, wrote a biography about Lemuel Haynes in 1837, so shortly after his death, called Sketches of the Life and Character of the Reverend Lemuel Haynes. And it's just such a wonderful book because a lot of Haynes' writings are integrated in the book, so we can hear Haynes' words for himself. The author insists that that Haynes' writings are in their original address and scarcely a verbal alteration. There's also a wonderful illustration of Haynes, an engraving that I'll post along with this video so you can see what the Reverend Lemuel Haynes looked like. And before I turn it over to Earl again, I'll say the last house that Lemuel Haynes lived in is in South Granville, New York, and it was actually declared a National Historic Landmark in 1975. It's privately owned, so it's not a museum, but it really stands as a testimony to Reverend Lemuel Haynes' legacy.
Thank you, Jen. As you can see, it's remarkable that we don't know about Lemuel Haynes in West Hartford, Connecticut, considering that he was born here. He was a brilliant mind and internationally published for his writings on federalism, or republicanism, at a time when racism and slavery were prolific in the United States. Because of this, the West Hartford African American Social and Cultural Organization, otherwise known as Whaasco, has joined together with the Beta Iota Boulay Foundation to raise money to build a memorial in West Hartford to commemorate Lemuel Haynes. And we're hopeful that we can be part of the Unity Green project that's going on in West Hartford. So look for more from that.
So Earl and I just happened to be talking, and we were talking about Lemuel Haynes, and I told him that I wanted to feature the Reverend Lemuel Haynes in one of my Armchair Tours, specifically in February in honor of Black History Month, which is a time to really honor and memorialize the accomplishments of Black Americans. And I thought, who better to pick first than Reverend Lemuel Haynes? So I hope you learned a little something new this week, and be on the lookout for that the plaque that will be memorializing Reverend Haynes, and we'll see you next week.